Apologize. I originally was intending to be there with you, but my wife came down with COVID yesterday, and so out of a abundance of caution, I'm hanging out here in Delaware County and didn't make the drive over to see you guys. But thanks for being here tonight, and thank you for that introduction. What you left out of the introduction is basically, let me just make sure I can get this. I'm a bird geek. As a kid, I was a birder, and you can see those from those bell bottoms in the 80s. I didn't have a lot of style, and I just never got away from birds. I went to BYU and studied anthropology. I was very interested in people and cultures because I love people, but the bird thing, I could never get away with it. And so that's how I eventually got to the University of Texas at Austin, where I could study geography. And there you could look at birds and people and the environment. So all the things that I loved, and that's where I ended up. And as you heard, I was able to do a lot of things, including start a bird observatory and lead the Travis Audubon chapter in Austin, Texas. And then I moved out here to Pennsylvania to work in the National Science Office. And when they shut that down, I started teaching, and I'm currently teaching at Rowan University. Here I am doing some research up in the highlands of Chiapas in Mexico. We'll talk about that in a minute. I love birds and birding, and I tend to see myself as kind of a, I don't know, hardcore birder, but I realize that that's not how everybody sees me. I do spend a lot of time in a van down by the river, by the airport in Philly, checking out the birds. So whether I'm a hardcore birder or just a geek with a PhD, it's hard to say, but I love birds, and that's why we're here tonight. We all love birds. I'm showing this California condor because it's such an important bird for me. When I was a kid, that geek birder in high school, I drove from Portland, Oregon, where I live, down to Southern California to see the last of the California condors before they were captured and taken into the captive breeding program. And long story short, 3 of the last 9 wild California condors flew very close overhead up on this ridge overlooking the Central Valley of California. And what they don't tell you, or I hardly ever hear it mentioned, is there is like an electric sound as the wind goes through those primary tips on the end of the wings of those condors. And I can say it's like sends chills. I'm getting chills just remembering it now. And that ruined me. I mean, there was never going to be law school. There was never going to be being a doctor after having that sound just ripple through me. So I love birds. And people have been watching birds for a long time. We know Leonardo da Vinci, he was fascinated by birds in flight. Here's a book that he was taking notes down, trying to understand how to fly. People have been wanting to fly like a bird for a long time. He was, one of the early ones that wrote down things about it. In the 1800s, they kind of came up with a whole new word, aviation. And aviation was the idea of flying. Aviation, the avia in aviation is bird. So aviation really just means birding, but birding has a different definition now. So we talk about aviation and birding, but really the idea of flying was we were wanting to copy these birds. And so people in the late 1800s were trying to understand how to do this. This book by Otto Lilienthal, Bird Flight as the Basis of Aviation. They're trying to copy these birds, and sadly, it didn't always work out. Otto Lilienthal here, he actually died in a crash because they learned how to fly, but they couldn't steer and land, and so they would sometimes crash, and that's what happened to him. Octave Chanute kind of compiled what everybody knew at the time, the very late 1800s, about flying. You can see there's a lot of mention of birds there. And our heroes, the Wright brothers, Wilbur Wright wrote a letter to that Octave Chanute to talk about how by watching turkey vultures shifting in the wind, they kind of figured how they could flex the wings of their plane, and that allowed them to steer. So basically, the Wright brothers learned how to steer by watching the turkey vultures. So that was a pretty cool thing. And others have been copying birds. In modern times, the bullet trains in Japan, those Shinkansen trains, they go so fast, they were actually causing problems as they would go in and out of tunnels because of the difference in air pressure. They would make kind of these sonic boom things. And it was a real problem until Eiji Nakatsu, engineer, went to a lecture where he heard about kingfishers and how kingfishers have to go from air to water, and that beak allows them to penetrate from the low density air to the high density water. And he thought, well, maybe we could make a beak on the front of a train like a kingfisher has. And sure enough, that solved the problem. No more problem going in and out of tunnels on these bullet trains. That's not the end of it. There was also another problem. The bullet trains were so rickety with the connection between the power cables above that the faster they went, the louder they were. And so they had to have speed limits, not for safety, but just because of the sound that was generated by these trains in residential neighborhood areas. But he learned, as many of us know, that owls have special fringes on their feathers that make them silent when they fly. So he reverse engineered these owl feathers and created a new type of connector for the bullet trains so that they could go silently. And that allowed the trains now to go faster. So copying birds, pretty cool thing. But these are just some recent examples. But as I'm sitting in my van down by the river, I'm thinking, well, gee, I mean, how long have we been doing this? How long have people been copying and mimicking birds? When I go down to Guatemala and Mexico and I study how birds fit into different Mayan cultures, one of the things that I was fascinated was they would tell us how the birds would show them where to go hunting. And I thought, well, that makes sense. They knew that if they heard a certain bird, it meant the habitat was good for a certain deer or peccary or something they were hunting. So that was cool. That made sense to me. So then I started thinking, well, how long have our ancestors been following birds to find our food? You know, we don't think about this because we just go to Giant and we get our food. But our ancestors had to find that food. And we have instances in Africa with the honey guides that lead people to the bees, and then the people take the honey, leave some of the comb for the bird. There's a whole research group that is looking at how birds and humans interact here. And again, how long does this go back? Vine Deloria was a Native American activist and scholar, died a few years ago. This is something that he had written about how in many Native American cultures, they recognize that people, we're not so fast, we're not so smart or anything, but by copying other animals and especially birds, they could learn how to survive and prosper. As it says here, man was the youngest member of the web of life and therefore had to have some humility in the face of the talents and experiences of other species. Now, this is not something common that we think of in our culture, but in many cultures around the world, this idea that we can learn from birds is a big deal. So we want to kind of explore that tonight. Recently, there was an article published about the archaeoornithology, the idea that we can study the interaction between birds, humans, and their environment. I'm like, hello, that sounds like what I've been doing for 20 years, but looking at it in the past, and they set up this little image here with this triangle with birds, humans, and their environment. And you can look at all the different arrows going in lots of directions there. There's a lot of things to study. What I want to look at is this here tonight. How have birds impacted the evolution of our bodies as well as the development of our cultures and our technologies? So we're looking at this arrow going from birds to humans. How have birds influenced us? Well, how far back do we want to start that? Because birds go back a long time. Here we got birds were hanging out in the time of the dinosaurs, and we don't go back that far. Well, we do, but not as humans. Our earliest known mammal ancestor, Jeremiah, fossil found in China, dates back about 160 million years ago. So there's your great-great-great-great-grandma right there. Also the great-great-grandma of all the other placental mammals. So not the marsupials, not the egg-laying platypuses in them, but most of what you think of as mammals all have evolved from little Jeremiah-like ancestors 160 million years ago. And in the meantime, birds were on the scene. And so our whole evolutionary path from that little Jeremiah to you and me has happened in the context of birds being our neighbors and in our environment. So what has that done for us? You can see here through the years, our body shape has changed until we get to some of the earliest primates. And what was happening there? There were, in the Cretaceous, lots and lots of different types of birds. In fact, birds were relatively small. They had to be small because the skies were really dominated by giant pterosaurs. Look at the size difference between all of the little birds that have been found so far and all the pterosaurs, these giant flying reptiles. Here's a human for comparison of size. The sky was dominated by these giant things, but there were lots and lots of birds. Here's reconstructions of what many of them looked like, and they were like many of the birds that you see today, though most of them had teeth. So, birds with teeth flying around. What are our ancestors doing? Sometimes we think, oh yeah, the mammals had to stay small in the time of the dinosaurs because of the dinosaurs. Forget the dinosaurs. What about these birds that are flying around, eating little rodent-sized ancestors of ours? That's a really scary thing. Right? I mean, the T-Rex, forget about it, right? Our little ancestors this big are not much to snack on unless you're a bird. So here we go. There's two sources of potential influence on our evolution at this point, way back in time. Birds could have been competition or they could have been eating us. So that's what we're looking at. Between the Jeremiah time and the first primates, our ancestors, they were nocturnal, living in trees. They were arboreal, mostly eating insects, presumably. But then they developed the ability to grab things with their hands. They developed forward-facing eyes and the ability to jump and grab stuff. So instead of just scurrying around, they're jumping and grabbing in an environment where birds have been evolving to fly and catch. Think of a flycatcher flying out, grabbing an insect and landing again. I'm not saying that our little ancestors copied them on, purposefully, thoughtfully, because they were animals, but they were competing in the trees for the same insects, and they had to adapt to be able to catch insects, and they did. So our ancestors became primates probably before this happened. The asteroid that wiped out almost all life on Earth 66 million years ago. Now, this was a huge event. I don't know if you sit around thinking about it enough. I think about it a lot because when you look at our evolution, here's a chart showing our evolution. The gray bar here, this is the Cretaceous, the time of the dinosaurs. The asteroid strikes here, and almost all of our evolution of the different types of primates, the apes, the old world monkeys, new world monkeys, the lemurs, all of these primates, there's a little fuzziness here on the time where it was either right before or right after that asteroid hit when all of this happened. All of this evolution has happened in the last 60 million years. At the same time, the same thing was happening with birds. So this is from a recent study. We think that there were probably maybe only 4 different lines of birds or 4 different lineages that survived that cataclysmic impact of the asteroid when the atmosphere was literally superheated and caught on fire and everything burned up. The ancestor, so here's that line again, showing where the asteroid hit. The ancestors of the emus and the ostriches made it through. The ancestor of the ducks and geese made it through. The ancestor of the, probably the ancestor of the whippoorwills, and they're related to hummingbirds and swifts, made it through. And then maybe just one other lineage that evolved into all of the lineages that we know. So this was a huge event that we shared in. Our ancestors, our little early primate ancestors made it through. They were eating fruit eventually. and they eventually start coming out into the daytime after this big destruction. Why was this happening? Well, one of the things that they've looked at is the fact that flowering trees really start taking off, and there gets to be more fruit and nuts and other opportunities of things to eat. And so one of the things to look at is how are we competing with the birds that were starting to evolve in eating these new resources? Well, we became things like tarsiers. This is an early type of a primate. Look at that ability to grab with the hands, to jump. Look at those jumpy little legs. They're cute, but they don't make airplanes, right? They got a long ways to go to become us. So we want to move quickly now from those early tarsier type of marsupials, primates. This is what the world was looking like. So we're scattered across a globe that doesn't look anything like what we know. And by 35 million years ago, this is what our ancestors look like, kind of the ancestors of monkeys. And they've become diurnal. We're no longer hiding at night. We're out in the daytime. We're eating fruit. We have really good eyesight, and our brains are getting bigger and bigger. Why? Why are all of these things happening? Well, to take advantage of these new fruit opportunities, and also and compete with all these new lineages of birds that are arising, like this Septemcoraceus, which is a big-brained fruit-eating bird. So the whole world is changing, and our ancestors are changing with it. It was very much a different world, including a world with these terror birds in it. They didn't have the predatory birds that we know of yet. Here's the ancestor of many of the falcons. They're running around. So evolution is happening. Our ancestors are adapting. We're becoming sexually dimorphic. That's something new. Males and females with different sizes and abilities. And then something really cool happens. All of a sudden, we go from having 2-color vision to 3-color vision. You can see here in the middle, this is what people that are colorblind see. Everything's kind of a yellow, mustardy color, or blue. But if you get 3-color vision, then you get the vision that most of us are familiar with. Why did this happen? Well, as these fruits are developing, one of the theories is that it allowed us to be able to find the fruit better. At the same time, birds have 4-color vision. So we had our measly little 2-color vision. The birds had 4-color vision. How are we going to compete? Well, when we finally evolved this 3-color vision, that really helped us out a lot, because there were a lot of new fruit-eating birds that were evolving. These barbets, parrots, all of these things were evolving at the time when our ancestors were becoming more like monkeys. And then eventually we become like apes. Why did we get bigger? Why did we lose our tails? What's going on? Well, there's something that was happening in the bird world that might have been impacting that, and that was the rise of these large carnivorous birds. So we have these eagles in Africa that eat monkeys, and one of the recent hypotheses is that potentially these crowned eagles, by eating monkeys, were putting pressure on our ancestors to become larger so that they wouldn't so easily be able to be grabbed out of the trees. Look how big the talons are on these. I mean, that you got to be pretty big to be able to not have that be a threat to you. So that's something that we're looking at now, is the impact of bird predatory pressure on our ancestors to move us from them kind of being more like a monkey to being more like an ape. So here's some of these early hominids 13 million years ago, 11 million years ago. You can see they're starting to look more like what we consider the great apes. And then about this time, the orangutan lineage splits off from us. There's 3 different species of orangutans. They're all very rare, and their habitat is highly threatened, but they're our distant cousins. Slightly closer to us are the gorillas, and then even closer are the chimps and bonobos. But there's a big difference between us and them. So how did that happen? How did we get from being very similar to a chimp or a gorilla or an orangutan to being modern humans? Well, we have to look at what was going on. And our ancestors were similar to these Ardipithecus, maybe 5.5 million years ago. They're living in woodland areas. They're eating a lot of fruits, nuts, and leaves. And the environment starts shifting. And you can see here, this is the lineage that leads up to us, starting off with that Ardipithecus in the middle there. Our ancestors are getting bigger. We start walking upright. One of the first of our early ancestors, the Australopithecines that was found, was the fossil of this, what it's called the Tong child. In 1924, they found this skull of a very young Australopithecine. These were proto-humans, and they only noticed a few years ago that there were some interesting things going on with this. There was actually holes in the skull that showed that this baby Australopithecine, one of our ancestors, had been carried off, eaten by one of these large eagles. So even as our ancestors were getting bigger and bigger, we still had predation happening, and so people were afraid of these things, and we had to learn to adapt to that. So that was happening as we were starting to become humans, but then something even more important starts happening. We actually start copying birds, and there's more evidence for this than ever before when we start looking at how they move out of the forest into the river and more open areas, and they're starting to eat carrion. And how are they finding the dead animals to eat? Well, they're following vultures. So this has been studied. One of the things they figured out was like, how long would a carcass survive out in the wild? And turns out along the riparian woodlands, the carcasses last longer. Out in the open, there's more competition for those carcasses. So our ancestors were probably following vultures through the scattered woodlands along rivers to find those food sources. And well, what do you find when you get to a carcass? Well, you've got all these vultures around, and you've got to figure out how to adapt and become part of that society and to take advantage of that food. So that's been going on for millions and millions of years. And so this is the first case that we know of, but it could have been happening other places as well, as we'll see in a second. We have the first evidence of butchering a carcass from 3.5 million years ago. And these are these simple stone tools. Were we copying the scraping action of the beak of vultures to try to harvest the food? Now, these weren't humans yet. These are early proto-humans, hominins, Australopithecines and Kenyanthropus, some of our early ancestors. But millions of years ago, they're using rocks now to scrape meat off of a carcass, because they don't have beaks and other implements to make it so easy to do. We're moving out into the more dry habitats of Africa. There's a lot of interesting things going out there, but as you move into different habitats, you need to find other foods. You're already following vultures. So this is where we start. There's going to be a lot of speculation here tonight from me. I'm going to draw upon research when there is research, but we're just trying to answer that question. How long have we been copying and following? And my hypothesis is it goes back at least this far. And what evidence can we find for that? There's birds like these hornbills that live on the edge between forest and more open areas. Are we following them around? When did we learn to eat more seeds? Were we following birds to other food sources out there in the savannah? There's plenty of birds running around, and if we're getting into the habit of following birds, you can learn a lot about how to even move in an open area. Were we copying birds to walk upright? There were plenty of birds out there walking around upright. No other mammals are really doing that. Here we are moving out into the savannah. So we need to, this is an open question, but I'm just putting it out there to think about. And we need to do a lot more research, obviously, but we know that we were following birds and learning a lot from them. Now, as the humans evolved, you can see this is a family tree. We become Homo habilis, then erectus, and then all these other groups as we move through time, as you move up the page here. One of the interesting things that happens is our hearing changes. Our hearing becomes much more tuned into the frequencies that birds use, more than our ape ancestors. So if we are following birds around, it's important for us to be able to hear them, to know where they are, distinguish between them. And so our hearing just so happens to become more focused in that frequency band that is used by calling birds. So we're following and copying birds. What does that make possible for us? Well, almost 2 million years ago, we find the first evidence of fishing and using fish, that our ancestors were starting to use fish. Now, they could have just scavenged fish on the edge of lakes and whatnot as well, but guess what? If only there was some bird that went around harvesting fish that maybe you could learn how to copy. And if you were to actually see one of these things in action, is this the origin of some of our behaviors, copying birds? Now, you've probably seen great blue herons fishing before. Did we just learn to copy them? Or what if we wanted to scoop them up? If we wanted to use a net to catch fish? If only there was a bird that was already out there scooping up, pelicans. But then you say, well, you got to be able to make those knots and put this together. If only there were birds out there in Africa making knots at the same time. Look at all these knots that are made by these weavers. It's amazing. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But once you start looking at the possibilities, it's everywhere. Even fire, the intentional use of fire, we have evidence that kites in Africa and Australia were moving fire around the landscape to burn out predators, or become fire-based predators, basically. Have you guys had Mark Bonta speak to you guys? He's from Central PA, and he's available. He's great. He's done some of this research on these fire hawks. It's made the news. So the early humans are using fire. They're fishing, they're building shelter. They have this bird hearing. They're becoming more bird-like all the time. And they're moving out of Africa, out across the landscape, including all the way down to the edge of the land, really, into what's now Indonesia. And you get, and I have a 5 lecture series, and I'm condensing a lot down, and I'm taking out a lot, but I couldn't bear to take out these little Homo floresiensis people, these small little people that made it all the way to the island of Flores. We don't know a lot about them. They're small. They were discovered in 2003. They're fossils. They're just short little people, and they were being predated on by these hawk eagles. There's also the Komodo dragons that would have been a problem for small little people. There were giant storks. There were rodents of unusual size. Also these dwarf elephants. So it's a whole weird world that some of our early relatives had found out there. And what did they do? How did they survive? Well, from what we can tell, they were part of a scavenging guild. And they're following vultures and those giant storks and Komodo dragons. They're following them around and competing for these carcasses. So it's just a fascinating world that has disappeared, but not that different from what all of our ancestors were doing. Now, there's one other thing that's interesting here. How did they get to that island? Well, presumably they rafted. Now, how would they know that you could even float and do this kind of thing? If only there were birds that floated around on, oh, wait, as I'm sitting again down behind the airport, watching terns floating down the Delaware River, or if you've been on a pelagic trip. Again, if you're paying attention, you can get lots of ideas. And my hypothesis is that our ancestors were getting these ideas by watching birds and becoming birds, basically, riding logs across water, using stone tools instead of beaks. When we're teaching birding classes, we always say, look at the beak, because that beak is the primary tool that a bird has. And so you want to, if you're trying to identify the bird, look at its beak, look at that tool. So we compare their beaks to tools, but maybe we should be looking the other way. How many of our own tools actually are based on copy from the beaks and other parts of birds and their abilities? So these are open questions, but hopefully it's tempting you to think about what was happening as we were becoming humans and becoming more effective as we move across the globe, as our ancestors become more and more modern, until 130,000 years ago, humans of our own species are now starting to spread out, interact with these earlier humans that had been moving around the landscape, and interacting with all kinds of weird other animals and big birds, these giant relatives of ostriches that lived in Europe at the time. It was a different world. We have to remember, it was a very different world, but things were changing. What about language? When did we pick up language? Charles Darwin thought we were copying other animals, including birds, in developing language. And even more modern researchers think that there's different parts of language. There's an emotive part to convey emotion, but then there's the lexical part where you connect a sound to a thing. And well, they believe that we might have been copying birds and developing that. So again, there's plenty more research that needs to be done here, but think about it. If we're copying birds and they're making all these noises, what does that do for us? Now, here's another cool thing. Before we're fully modern humans, we're using red pigment. Now, this is often considered to be the first sign of symbolic thinking. So similar to language, symbolic thinking, the idea of using colors to represent things. And so they're using this red iron oxide hundreds of thousands of years ago, before we're fully modern humans, we're using this, we're putting it on, we're decorating ourselves with it. And guess what? We weren't the first to do that either. Lammergeiers or bearded vultures, they do this. They coat themselves in this red dye that they get from bathing in these iron infused pools. So that they're really white, but they put on this thing. And guess what? They were right where our ancestors were at the time, here in the Rift Valley of Africa. We're out there competing with the vultures to get the food. And one of these vultures is going around putting red stuff on themselves. And our ancestors start doing that. Some people have thought this might have conveyed some sort of biological benefit. Maybe it was antibacterial, but others have said, look, this was maybe a ritual type of thing. So this is so far back in the realms of time, it's difficult to figure out exactly how this happened, but we started doing something really cool and interesting and new, but we weren't the first ones doing it. The birds were doing it. So once again, the birds were doing it first. So by the time we have Homo erectus, we've got fire, shelter, hand axes that are tools that maybe imitating bird beaks. And then Neanderthals. Now, when I was a kid, we thought Neanderthals were completely separate, but now we realize that we interbred with them in Europe. And I don't know have any of you taken the DNA testing to find out how much Neanderthal genes you have? Turns out I'm in the 96th percentile for Neanderthal genes, which means I'm basically a caveman. So, but our Neanderthal ancestors or cousins had these interesting relationships with the birds as well, including they were using this red ochre, just like our earlier ancestors were, and like they had learned from the Lammergeiers, and they're mixing it in these shells. And so this is again the symbolic thinking that's happening here, and it's tied to vultures. This is a really cool book if you can find it, The Smart Neanderthal by Clive Finlayson. He is looking at how birds and Neanderthals were interacting on Gibraltar. You know, they were interacting with snowy owls that would come down in the wintertime. They would go into caves at night with fire to catch the choughs that would roost in the caves. One of the first signs, again, of symbolic usage is these talons of eagles that are being used. They're drilled, so they're presumably being used as a necklace. This is one of the first signs we have of ornamentation, of decoration. That's not just the pigment, and it's found there with these Neanderthals. This is another, just a side little thing. It goes both ways. This is a small little finger bone of a Neanderthal that has passed through through a bird's gut. Now, they made it kind of sensationalized when it hit the news. They thought, oh, it's like these terror birds, but it was probably just a vulture or an eagle or something. But it presumably ate our little ancestor baby. All right, now let's get to the modern humans. It's taken us this whole time now just to get to the modern humans, but we've set the stage. Our earlier 3 fully modern human ancestors have learned to follow birds, copy birds, and do all this bird stuff. So what happens now as they spread across the landscape and develop these different cultures within the last 60,000 years? Well, we know they're following the shoreline, but just think about it. When did people first learn that you could crack one of these things open and eat them? Now, when you're having your seafood dinner, just think, who invented that? And were they, like Wilbur Wright, actually copying birds? We know there's oyster catchers. If you're following the shoreline and you're watching birds and noticing what they're eating, all of a sudden it opens up a whole new rich opportunity for you. There's oyster catchers on shorelines all across the old world. Did that help some of our early ancestors learn how to adapt to the shoreline and then follow that shoreline around the world? Back to the red ochre. Here's one more thing about this red ochre. We all have seen these handprint things. So next time you see these handprint things, think we may have been copying that use of pigment from these Lammergeier bearded vultures. When archaeologists find the red pigment in burials, it's considered one of the first signs of spirituality, the idea that they're doing something to the body because they believe that there's something is happening. It's some spiritual type of thing. So the first signs of spirituality in human society is this red ochre. And so what's the connection between birds and ochre and spirituality? Well, there's a lot to figure out there. Feathers. So not just, let's get closer to birds. It's hard to debate this one. Human societies all over the world use feathers to represent different things. These are Mayan and other Central Mexican peoples, our Native American peoples, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. They see birds as part of the cosmos. This giant emu in the sky is part of the important mythological landscape. And once again, those Australian Aborigines, remember, they had to float across a large water gap to get to Australia. So they were doing it maybe just rafting, but here's one we know is very well documented of people literally following birds, the Polynesian colonization of the Pacific. Their traditions of seagoing are very much tied to birds. Their seagoing canoes are built and labeled as birds. As you can see here, there's the bird's back, the beak, the chin. They are birds. They're following the birds. Their navigation of the sky, they have bird constellations, and they know how the birds are moving across the ocean and which birds are only seen close to land. And so literally they're following birds across the Pacific Ocean to colonize all of that. So that's a really good example of people copying birds, and they're copying birds so much they're actually making clothes out of their feathers. Now, we don't think about, we have our down jackets, right? We have our wild goose down jackets and we think, oh, this is nice. It's not just nice. This would have been crucial for people to be able to colonize parts of the world where the climate maybe was too harsh. Native Americans, we think of them running around in furs and stuff, but really, if you look, even here, the Lenni Lenape people, when the first explorers go up the Hudson River, they see them and they're decked out in turkey feathers. They got these turkey feather cloaks, turkey feather blankets. Turkeys were probably good eating, but even more important, they were a source of feathers for people to be able to live in a landscape. I mean, when it's a cold, nasty day outside here, think how did the native people survive? Just in their wigwams? Well, they had these wonderful bird feather blankets and clothing. So literally using the birds, that's one thing. But what about copying them? How many of you are familiar with the tailor bird in South and Southeast Asia? They literally sew their nest together. They poke holes in the sides of the leaves and then they string fibers through it. They are literally sewing. So when did people start sewing? Did we have to invent this? Or if we were paying attention and we noticed this, we're like, oh yeah, I can get a sharp thing like a bird beak and I can make holes. That's called an awl, right? And then you can put the fibers through it. My hypothesis here is that people copied the tailor bird, and that's the origin of sewing. How would we prove something like this? Well, we're going to need to do some more folklore analysis, but if you look at where and when they find needles and sewing, it usually it's after humans have arrived in the range of the tailor bird. So the first evidence of needles are up in Siberia, but it's after we've gone through here. So open case to still be looked at there. All right, here's something. Maybe I'm out there in the hypothetical weeds, but birds and music. This one is very beautiful, right? We know that birds sing, they make music, we make music, and literally there's many cases where we can document that people have copied birds. So Lucretius, he believed that the origin of birds was people copying the birds. That's where we got music. There's a Lakota Native American story of how a young hunter heard the wind going through a tree filled with woodpecker holes, and that was how he was able to develop the flute. We know even in more modern times of composers copying the music of birds. This is the Nightingale song. Can you hear this?
No.
Is the sound coming through on that?
No.
Okay, we won't pause there, but you can look it up. Here's another one. I wish the sound was going through because it's this is from my research in Mexico. This old guy, his tradition of native flute music had all but disappeared, but he resurrected it by copying the sound of the birds in the this is on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And so that was a guy that I found, and it's just a wonderful thing. But we've got early instruments made out of bird bones. So this connection between the sounds, the literal bodies, the actions of the birds inspires a lot of our music and has for forever. What about birds and dance? I mean, most of you have seen cranes dancing. Are we just copying birds when we dance? Yes. And how far back does it go? Well, the earliest monumental architecture, the earliest temples that we find are in Turkey and Göbekli Tepe, and it's very, very old. And here's a reconstruction, and on these pillars of these, I mean, these are hunters gatherers. They don't have agriculture yet, but they're gathering together. Why are they gathering together? For some sort of ritual purpose, and they're building these things, and there's cranes and vultures. So there's a vulture there on the left, long-legged cranes on the right. What are they doing there? Why are they depicting that? Well, we know a little bit later in Catalhoyuk, in the same part of the world, we find evidence of using crane wings as presumably dance ornaments. There's a painting on the wall of this here, and here's a reconstruction. The idea is that they are literally putting on bird feathers and they're dancing. Now, the ancient Greeks knew all about this, and this is from the shield of Achilles, and it's described by Homer. These ring dances where people get in big rings and they dance, they're copying cranes and other birds. Native Americans have these dances that, for all the world, it looks like this. In fact, that is the origin of many of their dances. They're literally copying birds. This is these prairie chickens and grouse. So music, dancing. What about weaving? Well, the earliest weaving evidence we have is only 26,000 years old, but how hard is it to copy a bird when you start copying birds? What about ceramics? If only there were birds that made vessels out of clay. Perhaps you've seen these, So did we get the idea there? Again, there's a lot of this is becoming speculative, but once you see the pattern, you start thinking, where else could it be? What else? Well, what about agriculture? Now, when we think of agriculture, we think of cereal grains, wheat and rice and all of that. But are there birds that plant seeds in the ground? These jays in the range of the early farming and agriculture, they're out there putting these acorns in the ground, and people were using those acorns as resources as well. Did they get the idea to plant these things themselves rather than just going through the environment and gathering them by watching jays? We don't know, but it's something that we can look at and look into the traditions, because some of these things actually get preserved in folklore. This is only 12,000 years ago, maybe. So we have stories that last that long in human culture. So more research to be done. In my own research with the Mayans, they tell how the woodpecker got his red head by a thunderbolt that was sent down by a god when he was helping to release corn from the mountain. The people saw the ants carrying corn, little grains of corn out, and they wanted it, and the woodpecker opened it up so the people could have the corn. So again, a bird tied to the origin of agriculture. How many more stories are like this out here? There's plenty of research to be done. Okay, here's a fun one. Social stratification, the idea that people can be at different levels in society. We're not all the same. We're not egalitarian. We have different levels. There's kings, and then there's, all of these different layers. That's a fairly new thing in human existence. In fact, this idea that you can have a human pecking order, did it actually come from people domesticating and interacting and living closely with chickens and their pecking order? Here you can see the time frame of when chickens are domesticated, and then this spreads across the old world, and literally the origins of this differentiation in society between higher and lower class or status people. It comes in the same time and place as people are starting to interact with chickens. So more research to be done. Birds and writing. Have you ever looked at cuneiform, this early Sumerian writing, and go, oh man, that looks like chicken scratches, right? Or maybe if you had bad penmanship, your teacher told you, oh, you got chicken scratches. Is there a connection between birds and writing, as there is potentially between our symbolic language use and our following birds? Well, here's one speculation from Priscilla Long, saying that, basically reading and tracking are pretty much the same thing. They're signs that you learn that have a meaning, and you follow the sign. And so that's very similar to reading. There is some evidence that has come down that Kanji, who created the Chinese hieroglyphic writing system was copying the signs of birds and other animals. So potentially there could be a connection there. The ancient Greeks sometimes said that cranes were the inventors of the alphabet because of they would fly in these different configurations, and that's where they said that's where they got their idea of different shapes for letters. So is that true? Is that just folklore? Ancient folklore. This was stuff that was thousands of years ago. People were saying it, at least in their minds, they were seeing a connection as well. All right, we're getting towards the end here. Birds and religion. This is a very human thing for us to do. In my own research with the Mayan, the ancient Mayans, birds were the messengers of the gods, and people would learn what God wanted by paying attention to the gods, and gods could take the form of birds. That's a whole nother 5-lecture series that I've given on this. In our closer to our own tradition, the ancient Roman aspects, the priests who would hold the lithium in their hand and measure out a temple. That's where we get our word temple from, the priest measuring out this area and divining the will of the gods from the direction of birds flying through this sacred space that has been measured out. So again, that's where we get our word temple from people watching birds to try to understand the larger context of the world that they live in. When we say that something is auspicious, we're saying it's something that the gods have blessed by the birds, the aves. So I've lectured on this a lot. We could have a whole nother time on I call it ornithology, the connection between birds and religions around the world, going back to the earliest times. There's a lot to be said there. But again, we've learned a lot by incorporating what we've learned from the birds. Now, there's a lot of future research to do. As I've mentioned here, a lot of this is speculative. Maybe you've had some of your own ideas as I've been talking tonight. But what's tricky is we got to look at lots of different disciplines to be able to answer these questions. And a lot of people are not trained multidisciplinarily, and it's hard to have multidisciplinary teams. So there's a challenge here that our science is not set up to ask these questions. Most of these questions that are coming to me as I'm watching birds in my van down by the river are very difficult to answer because you need expertise across lots of different fields. Now, I love geography because it lets me look at all of this, but we need more partnerships in all of these areas to develop it. And then why would it matter? Is it just a fun story to tell about the past? If I'm correct in thinking that birds have led us to develop so many of our technologies and become who we are culturally and physically, then maybe we need to be doing more of that. Maybe that's who we are as people, right? Maybe we need to be doing, and there is biomimicry as a field of engineering, so we can keep doing that. Here's a new airplane that was proposed by Airbus in 2019. Would it be cool to see these things coming into land at Philly? That would be very, very cool if we got something like that. We live in a world of environmental troubles, partly because we have disconnected ourselves from the birds and the other things. This is a book that came out by Timothy Beatley. He's writing about the bird-friendly city. My own dissertation was on how to make cities good for birds and people. The idea is if we want to live on this planet, maybe we should be watching those birds more closely and designing our technologies to include, copy, make the world a good place. It's not just a canary in a coal mine situation, which we talk about, but we should be more active, following the birds, creating cities that are good for birds and people, and that can lead us to sustainability. So this is something else I worked on when I was at Audubon, working on urban bird conservation. yeah, it's nice to have a park with birds, but wouldn't it be nice if we had a whole civilization that was designed not just for buildings to fall down in 300 years, but to last forever and have all the birds that evolved in this landscape still part of the landscape. So that's it for tonight. That's the big question. Were birds first? Open question, but I've presented some thoughts and ideas, and I look forward to any of your questions and thoughts that you may have. So thank you very much.